Hello, I'm Rachel Brisley, Head of Energy and Environment at Public Affairs at Ipsos, and we'll be having a discussion now about climate impacts, climate adaptation, and how those impacts and the adaptation is distributed. I'm really pleased to welcome Richard Millar, Head of Adaptation at the Climate Change Committee, to join me in this discussion. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Rachel. Good to be here.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much for joining us. I realise it's a very busy time for you at the moment, with things like the UK or the English National Adaptation Programme being published last week. So at the moment, we're in the world, it seems, or large parts of the world are actually on fire as climate impacts really start to hit. And what we're really interested in is getting your thoughts on how different groups in society are differently impacted by climate change now, and how that's likely to happen in the future.
Yeah, I think the what's happening now is always, I find, a chastening reminder of how immediate and how these kind of climate impacts are not just something for the future for somebody else far off in a different place. Therefore, the here and the now, really, and that's both in the UK and in countries adjacent to us. Seeing what's happening in Europe right now, these are kind of things that are affecting people, and this is obviously a global problem, and many of these impacts are being felt most strongly in developing parts of the world, but it does drive home that this is being felt by people and by yourself as well, in many instances. So I think I find that sort of a useful reminder of why we're doing this, and what the sort of value for thinking about risk from climate change and what we can be doing today to prepare for it is, really. So maybe just, yes, opening thoughts on how to think about how climate change can affect people differently. The way I think about it really is almost like the where, the who, and almost the why of why people are affected by climate change. So one of the easiest ways I think of thinking about why some people are affected more than others is that all these impacts are inherently local. If you're going to be affected by flooding, it's partly because you live in an area that is just has that right geography, that right climate that creates a risk. If you're by a river or not, to be sort of in the sort of simplest situation. So that's partly what drives, I think, how it affects people differently is where you live. And we obviously know there are a lot of different factors underlying who can live where within our country or similar countries. But then I think even taking those people who live in those areas where you might be affected by, say, a flood or other kinds of impacts from weather, who you are can significantly affect what you can do about it, really. So to what extent you're able to manage the risk. Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the sort of understanding of what you should be doing to reduce the damage to yourself and to the people you care about? And just also fundamentally how much your risk varies as well. So if you're an old person, we know that generally if you're more old, more in ill health already, you're more at risk from health impacts from heat waves, for instance, than someone who's very fit and maybe less old. So all of those factors kind of end up in this sort of melting pot together, really. Varying about how we experience climate change, but the ones that jump out to me really are kind of age, income, and quite often a sort of rural and urban split as well in how you experience climate risk. So we know that some heat waves get hotter in the cities. So if you're living in urban areas, generally your heat waves are going to be a bit hotter than if you're living in the adjacent countryside. Similarly, if you live in the countryside, you might face different kinds of climate risk, flooding associated with sort of managing the whole river catchment, perhaps, to protect cities downstream, but also things like if we have, plantation forestry, or sort of heathland that will be increasingly at fire risk, you might be the ones who are going to breathe in that smoke when that goes up more than those in urban areas. So there's maybe some useful distinctions about maybe thinking about how this varies across different parts of society.
Yeah, really, really interesting to note there, talking about the way you distinguish that between, the why, the who, the where. And I guess in terms of the who, those types of the sort of groups in society you've talked about, I guess, are the people who are generally vulnerable anyway. So people on maybe lower incomes who are less able to afford things, people who are unwell or disabled or very old or very young. I mean, would you is there a difference between, I guess, general vulnerability to any external impacts and particularly climate change?
I think they're often pretty correlated. I think, aren't they? You can, as you rightly highlighted there, often a good predictive factor across these different kinds of climate impact is your current vulnerability now, and we know that's true of people. But we also know that's kind of true in the natural environment as well. Those environments and ecosystems that are in poor states today, that are stressed by other kinds of pollutants or issues. Those are the ones that might be particularly impacted by the next drought or the next heat wave, for instance. And it's kind of the same, I think, in some extent, with people, both the sort of other stresses that they have on themselves, to what extent this can be a priority for them. And then thinking about also, people's ability to adapt, the sort of, capacity for adaptation, it's kind of called in sort of more technical literature. I think a lot of that is connected to wealth and to income. Again, taking the sort of example of overheating in homes during heat waves. Often some of the most effective things, not all, there are some sort of relatively cheap things that can be done to help reduce how hot your homes get, but some of the most effective things, like external shading, like air conditioning, for instance, are things that do have quite a price tag associated with them. So if you're generally more well off, you're often able to afford to adapt your housing, whereas someone else just down the road, for instance, who's not sufficiently or similarly well off, might not have those options available, and their sort of ability to do something about the weather risks that they face when they happen, could be significantly different, really.
Yeah. And in the delivery of our public services within the country, so from the government through to sort of local authorities, NHS, other public services, I mean, how well do you think, how well do you think these services are sort of building, accounting for climate change and also for these variable impacts, and thinking about differential ways of supporting different groups? I mean, is that being done in the UK at the moment? Is there more that can be done?
I think it's my sort of sense would be it's starting to be done, but there's definitely lots more that can be done to take that further. So, I mean, thinking about again, that sort of heat health example, we're knowing more and more a bit around how the sort of hazard of heat waves maybe varies across the country, how it maybe is more severe in urban areas, but what we still, I think, have that sort of insufficient understanding is the vulnerability side, is where are the people who are most vulnerable, that we can sort of overlay with that maybe sort of increasingly sort of refined spatial knowledge on the kind of hazard and the exposure side. But we really need to bring that vulnerability in. I think there's a growing awareness of the importance of doing that, and some really interesting moves to provide more evidence, really, that will be hopefully enable delivery bodies such as the health service or councils and social care to sort of think about these things, and to really try and find those people who are going to be particularly at risk, and think about how they could prioritize actions that are going to have the biggest bang for your buck, really, in sort of preventing people from being impacted by climate change. But I think we're really at the start of that journey, and there's a lot more that needs to be done, be developed in the evidence base to do that, but also just awareness, understanding, skills in these delivery agencies to be able to take that evidence, apply it, and be as sort of efficient and effective with the policies in finding the people who are going to be most vulnerable and effectively protecting them.
Yeah. And I'm aware that, in terms of thinking about flooding rather than overheating, which is, again, one of the key risks of the UK, that the the way that government funding for flood schemes is actually skewed towards areas of deprivation. And I guess it's just interesting to think about funding more broadly, and funding for public services. And are there any other examples of actually looking at supporting, whether it's more immediate weather or climate impacts, or longer term climate change through public services?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point you raise around how he sort of prioritised the funding. And as you said, there are some mechanisms to try and take account of this in some areas. But within the work that we've done at the committee, one of the things that we've felt has been important in thinking about how to embed fairness in the sort of policy design of all of this is to be quite cognizant of the kinds of implicit biases that you might make in designing a policy goal, even, and sort of, I think, as I'm sure you'll be well aware, Rachel, the sort of naive application of, the flood prevention strategy might be, let's just look at cost benefit. Let's look for where we can get the sort of most avoided flood damages for our intervention money. And without those kind of factors that make you think about the sort of vulnerability and the sort of distributional side of it, it might push you towards, well, of course we're protecting the big cities because that's where the houses are worth the most, and houses that are worth less in other parts of the country are just inherently downweighted without some of these mechanisms. So yeah, I think it's kind of important to be as cognizant of those kind of potential biases as much as possible across the piece really there. And I think there are a few sort of initiatives that are popping up that are thinking about just transition, and can help with some of this. So again, thinking about some of the work in Scotland on the Just Transition Commission, a lot of that has been around the decarbonisation side, but we've been asking really that extends out into the climate resilience side, and there's definitely ambition to extend that work across, and some of these kinds of I guess vehicles to have these kind of societal conversations around what do people value, and how do they see this question of who should we be protecting, and should we have this sort of particular priority for people who might be the most at risk from these things. I think are really important vehicles to get that into the policy making side of things, because it's easy to forget. I think that's one of our sort of key conclusions, that just almost by accident really, as opposed to sort of an intention, that unless you explicitly build these things in, it's very easy for them to slip out, I think, and you end up just sort of, maybe pursuing policies that are not going to have that fairness and that sort of justice at its heart.
And presumably, that's interesting. You just raised about just transition, which I know is a particular focus in Scotland and Wales, actually, but largely focusing on a just transition to a net zero world. But I guess if we were looking at a just transition to a climate resilient world, there's probably a number of the same groups affected by moving towards a net zero world as those being affected by climate impacts, and also potentially some of the same sort of activities that you could do to address both. So I guess I'm thinking about, if you think about maybe people on lower incomes getting support with energy efficiency, but also at the same time, making sure that those homes aren't overheating. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on how we could, government, particularly public services, could better deliver those two things together.
Yeah, definitely. I think the example you used there, I think, is a really good one, in that there are already programs out there. Whether at the sufficient scale or not is obviously debatable, but to help with this retrofit challenge for people who are generally on the poorer end of society, and as you said, unless we're actually thinking about, well, what will that retrofit do to the internal temperatures when the next 40-degree heat wave comes around, like last year, whenever that is, that you could be unintentionally putting people at increased climate risk, or ultimately saying, well, we're going to have to spend more money, whether that's from the public purse or asking people to pick up that themselves, which if you're at that lower end of the income distribution, you often might not be able to on retrofitting for overheating later. So, it feels like a win-win to try and sort of make those public funding streams that generally going to be seeking to serve the sort of more lower income parts of the income distribution, who are often at the most climate risk, as we've discussed. Really think about both those challenges at the same time. I guess the other one is connected to sort of land and land use, and sort of this issue of what's a fair sort of rural transition. When you think about farmers, they're both, at the forefront of many of these decarbonisation questions, particularly livestock farmers. But, they're also being asked to sort of increase carbon in their soils at the same time as being on the forefront of climate change, really, with being impacted through the droughts, the heat, water availability risks that that climate change will increasingly bring to parts of the country in the future. So again, unless there's a kind of coherent, joined up package of how does that all make sense and how can you make it add up as a sort of fair financial package for the actual farmer who's you're expecting to do a lot of this, then it'll fall short. And I think kind of putting fairness at the heart of that, connecting the two issues and connecting it with fairness, is actually the only way you'll probably solve that rural challenge particularly. So it feels like it's not really a nice to have. It's pretty essential actually if we want to make headway on some of those joint challenges of resilience and decarbonisation.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, to move on to like maybe slightly more positive. No, I guess with climate change, we talk about the risks, we talk about the impacts, and clearly there have been some very severe impacts just recently. But there are also maybe some opportunities, and I guess just thinking in terms of the just transition to net zero. There's obviously a lot of job opportunities around sort of green economy, etc. Do you see any? I guess two questions. One is, do you see any particularly opportunities for sort of society and the economy and the environment around a just transition to climate resilience? But also, do you know of any examples where things are working well and actually that there are co-benefits in addition to the adaptation benefits?
Yeah,
sorry, that feels a bit like an exam question.
I'll give it my best go. Picking up your point at the end there on co-benefits, I think a lot of the nature-based solutions, should, if sort of thought about and implemented well, deliver on many of those things. In that, design well, they should increase the amount of carbon being stored, being able to sort of protect both the immediate locale, but also downstream settlements, for instance, from flood risk, and provide, hopefully, increases in biodiversity in those landscapes. But I think then the final bit, the really crucial one, is then the job opportunities and the economic opportunities again for those rural parts of the country that are expected to deliver it. So you feel like there definitely is a win-win-win-win there, probably. But actually realizing it is clearly the challenge, and it's going to be a role for strong standards there that have kind of principles of fairness baked into their design. I think, things like the carbon markets discussed globally kind of do start to engage a bit with these topics around, not leading to, unintended negative outcomes on people's livelihoods, on the biodiversity in the areas. Is kind of having those kinds of things applied in the schemes that we're doing in the UK. So things like the Woodland Carbon Code, the Peatland Carbon Code are vehicles to try and get to some of this. And if we kind of can operationalize those, give them sufficient funding as well from the public funding that's needed to turbocharge these, and hopefully draw in then private investment as well, that you feel like there are opportunities to deliver there. And I think there are some good examples to look at for that. There's interesting things that the Environment Agency is trying, I think, for instance, to deliver across those different goals, to provide new funding mechanisms for it. So things like the Wyre Valley project there, nature-based solutions in the Wye Valley, that's kind of trying to find ways to monetize this, do it in fair ways that benefit the people who actually have to take those actions on the land, are interesting things to look at there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Richard. That's been really, really interesting conversation, and yeah, good luck with your continued work at the Climate Change Committee in this area. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much.